Welcome to our presentation on co-teaching for equity. I'm Andrea Golloher. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Special Education at San Jose State.
And I'm Lisa Simpson. I'm also assistant professor in special education at San Jose State.
Yeah, and we're excited for you to be here to talk about co-teaching, and especially after that amazing presentation this morning about what's going on at Prospect High School. We're hearing so many people talking about co-teaching and wanting to implement co-teaching and thinking really deeply about what can be done with co-teaching, and it was great to see what they're doing. So I need to stand in this box. I apologize if I start fidgeting because I'm used to walking around while talking. We're going to start at the beginning with what is inclusive education. If you look at IDEA, our special education law, the Individuals with Disabilities in Education Act, it doesn't actually reference inclusion. It talks about the least restrictive environment. Oh, I don't need my reading glasses on. I just realized that's why you all look funny. Okay. The least restrictive environments. And so that definition is that to the maximum extent appropriate, students will be with their non-disabled peers. But if you look at UNESCO, which is the UN division on education, they have a much broader definition. They talk about inclusive education as a process of addressing and responding to the diversity of needs of all learners through increasing participation in learning, cultures, and communities, and reducing exclusion from education and from within education. And I find this definition to be really inspiring for all that it makes me think about. Because the UNESCO definition doesn't apply solely to individuals with disabilities. If you think about that, what they're doing and what education looks like around the world, it's talking about any marginalized group, any group of children who are excluded from the country's main education system. And so sometimes that's girls, sometimes that's ethnic minorities, and sometimes that's people from who might be refugees. There's a lot of things that America does well in our education system, and one of them is the stance that we've taken on the rights of all children to be in our public school systems. That's something we can be proud of. But it also makes me think about, what does this mean, exclusion from education? So that's easy to think about, but also from within education. So just because we're here, we're in the same room, or we're in the same building, doesn't necessarily mean we're getting the same education. And so how do we address that? So if you think of the LRE definition of inclusion, it's often easy to think about like this one goal and one path towards inclusion. And sometimes you hear people talking about like, oh, they are so much further along on inclusion than we are, or we're further along than some other state. As if it's a linear journey that once we get on it, we're gonna move forward and get to an end goal. But if you think about the UNESCO definition, because we're thinking about all of these different groups, we have multiple goals and multiple paths. And then it becomes less about thinking about where are we on a spectrum, but how are we expanding our reach from within education. And that's where we have found it useful to use the intersectionality framework that Crenshaw introduced in 1989. Now, we've been hearing about this a lot more just in the media and in conversations that we've been having about our society in general. I was afraid to go to this literature. I was like, oh my gosh, this is a really, people are talking about this really complicated issue. Then when I went and I read her article, I was like, oh, this isn't hard at all. This makes so much sense. So if you are struggling with this concept of intersectionality, I encourage you to find this 1989 article that she wrote. Also, she's a lawyer, so then I was like, oh no, this is gonna be like legalese. And lawyers are great people, but they're not known for making things easy to read. But this article really did a nice job of breaking apart what had happened in the US at that time with the passage of anti-discrimination law and also feminist rhetoric that both erased the unique needs and experience of Black women. And she goes in to describe these cases that were brought before before judges about discrimination. And so Black women would come in, and maybe they were all working in a factory, or maybe they were all working for a hotel, and they would say, we were discriminated against. We were systematically passed over for promotions. You know, we can show that some people have been here for longer, and then these other people were hired instead of one of us being promoted. And it's infuriating to read the judges' responses, basically either saying, well, you brought this in, you said it's because you're Black, but actually it's because you're women, and so we're gonna throw this case out. And then, oh, you said you're women, but actually it's because you're Black, so we're gonna throw this out, as if that still isn't discrimination. That's happening. And so she brings up that we really need to pay attention to where our identities intersect and how those intersections influence our experiences. And I think we see that, let me see, where am I gonna go? I'm gonna go backwards. When we think about our students, when we talk about disproportionality in our schools, when we talk about meeting the needs of students who are emergent bilingual and who have a learning disability, and sometimes we start to try and divide it up. Like, we're gonna take this kid's disability to special education and their language learning to the English resource teacher. And we can't divide the kid up. They're bringing their identity wherever they're going, and what we want to do is to provide them the best access we can to the general education curriculum, because that's what we, as a society, have said they need by the end of high school. And so, when we're looking at inclusion, we're thinking we've moved, and people are familiar with all of these different graphics, moved from this issue of equality and just making sure everyone's in the room to equity and making sure everybody who's in the room is provided with what they need to be able to participate. And I like this one, so I've seen the baseball field example so many times, I was so excited to see something different. So here we have the different bicycles, you know, giving everyone the same bike. It actually made me think about the like Ford bikes that are out around San Jose. They are all the same size. I hadn't really thought about that. But people are gonna need different bikes. You might need a mountain bike versus a cruiser, or you might need an adapted bike or a tricycle. So, that's all well and good. We need to keep that in our mind. But we also need to remember, what is special education? So special education is housed in the Office of Civil Rights, which is part of the Department of Ed. And within the Office of Civil Rights, there's 3 major laws that we think about when we're in the education system. The first, the last one that was passed, is the Americans with Disabilities Act. And if you think about that, that is saying that we are going to make sure that our environments are generally accessible to individuals who have a variety of needs. You don't have to disclose that you have a disability. You don't have to say, I use a wheelchair to move around, in order for us to say, we're going to make sure there's a ramp for you. Instead, we're just going to say there is a ramp, and it turns out that that's useful for a lot of people. And so when we think about that in education, we think about universal design for learning. How do we build those ramps in our education, in our curriculum, so that way as many students as possible can get into our general curriculum? Then we have the Section 504, which, if you have a Section 504 plan but not an IEP, you are able to access accommodations. So if you have a need that, I'm trying to think, diabetes, there we go. So you have diabetes, you need to make sure that you're able to eat throughout the day. And in order to make sure that you're able to do that and you're not getting in trouble because you're eating, the school will have a 504 plan and say that this student is allowed to access their snacks in such and such a way, so that way no individual teacher can say, I don't think that you need it. And most teachers wouldn't, but just in case, we would have that there. And then if you move then to the Individuals with Disabilities in Education Act, that's where we get into special education. So kids can have accommodations without receiving special education services. But if you if your disability impacts your learning or your ability to access the general curriculum to an extent in which you need specially designed instruction or modifications to the curriculum, then we say we're going to provide an IEP. And the IEP will also include accommodations. And so we're really housed in this smaller bubble, but we talk about all of the bubbles when we're talking about moving to inclusive education. We're not going to be able to successfully move to an inclusive environment if we're not taking care of the general curriculum through UDL. Or it's going to be just a lot harder. If you have, we're only going to do lectures in this class, and then one student just isn't going to learn through sitting through an hour-and-a-half lecture. It gets a lot harder to provide the accommodations and specially designed instruction. So let's look at what that specially designed instruction is. It is adapting as appropriate to the needs of an eligible child under this part. This is from the law. The content, methodology, or delivery of instruction to address the unique needs of the child that results from the child's disability and ensure access of the child to the general curriculum so that the child can meet the educational standards within the jurisdiction of the public agency that apply to all children. And this is the sort of thing that I was afraid to read when I saw that Crenshaw was a lawyer, and I was like, oh no, it's going to be something like this. Very precise language that can be a little bit dense. But essentially what we're saying is that any student receiving special education services should be receiving specially designed instruction, which means that we're going to look at the content, methodology, and delivery of instructions based on that child's unique needs. So this is no longer thinking about, in general, what on-ramps can we put in our curriculum, but specifically what accommodations and instruction are we going to provide for that student so that they can access the curriculum. And so we need to accommodate needs, modify instruction, and provide specially designed instruction. So just a quick note, I think that most people in the room are familiar with the differences between accommodations and modifications. You come from teacher preparation, you always want to repeat this so that way everyone knows. But the accommodations are changes in how the student is going to access the curriculum, whereas modification is changes in what the student is going to be learning. And that's important for us because once we go to modifications and changing what a student is learning, we need to really be careful about whether or not we're taking that student off the diploma path. And really that's only appropriate for students with pretty significant levels of impairment. Oh, what were you going to say?
Only needs accommodations.
Oh, and if a student only needs accommodations, they shouldn't have an IEP. That should be a Section 504 plan. And I hope that that's clear to everyone, but I do have, I have some friends who have disabilities who say, so one of my friends has CP, and she says that every year her parents had to go fight for her to be in the general classroom. And it's like, but you, the only issue was that she needed support in getting around her not ADA school because she went to high school before, or went to school before ADA was passed. And even after ADA was passed, her two-story high school in the Midwest wasn't immediately, retrofitted with an elevator. So she needed support, she needed accommodations to make sure she could get to all the classes in the building. But once she was in the class, she was able to participate fully. And so when she told me that, I said, but you should have had a 504. What are you talking about? You had an IEP. Well, that was her life. Then, in addition to providing the accommodations and possibly modifications, we need to look at the specially designed instruction that we're providing. And Friend and Barron have highlighted 7 elements of specially designed instruction that we need to think about. And I know I haven't talked about co-teaching yet, but when we are doing co-teaching, we still need to be thinking about specially designed instruction and making sure that we're providing the instruction that the student needs, that we said they need because they qualify for an IEP. So SDI is a teacher action. You can think of an accommodation as sometimes a student action. So if you're going to say with the student who has diabetes that they can get a snack when they need to, that could be a student action. But this is a teacher action that the teachers need to make sure they're doing something. And the thing that they should be doing is systematic, carefully planned, and monitored. And is not just a strategy you would use for every struggling learner. Even if that strategy might help other struggling learners, you're using the strategy because it specifically addresses the need of the student with the IEP. With the intended goal of curriculum access, and it's not specified to a location. So specially designed instruction is not being in a SAI classroom or in an SDC. It's having the teacher actions that are systematically, carefully planned and monitored, and so on and so forth. And in an inclusive environment, it requires special education teacher skills that are facilitated by the general education teacher. So it has this element of collaboration and must result in improved outcomes for students with IEPs. So if you're trying your best, but the outcomes aren't moving, then we need to go back. Because we've carefully monitored our instruction, we're gonna go back and change things. We don't just put things in place and hope that they're gonna work. Any questions at this point? Okay. So it should be direct and explicit instruction delivered in a step-by-step manner that allows more opportunities for practice than would be needed by typical learners. And it should be research-based. And there's some really great resources on the internet. Intervention Central, if you haven't been there, is really useful, especially if you're in an RTI system. The Affirm modules, oh wait, that's not the Frank Porter Graham Autism PDC.
Yeah, those are the Affirm
Oh, those
modules.
are the Affirm modules.
Actually, that's just the EBP report.
So that's the evidence-based practice report for students with autism. And then the Cedar Center out of the University of Florida has a lot of really useful tools as well to think about your instruction.
Looks like we have plenty of time. Do you want to quickly go to that Intervention Central?
Sure thing. I do really like this. Let me see if it's gonna.
Hope it'll allow you to exit out and go there. How many of you are familiar with Intervention Central? One person in the back room, 2, 3. All right, so just a few people.
So yeah, so let's take a second and look at this because I love the way it's organized. So if you go to the homepage, this is what you'll see. But let's say you know that you have a student who is struggling in an academic area. Click on the academic interventions and wait. And then look at what they did. They have the academic interventions sorted by specific academic need. It's great. So I really need help with sight words. Well, here's some strategies for sight words. I need math facts. What are the strategies for math facts? Reading phonics, academic anxiety. So they have a lot of tools. And if you go to, I'm just going to go to Cover, Copy, Compare. Whoops. You'll get a little description of what it is, some materials sometimes if that makes sense, and some step-by-step instructions for how to implement that practice, and references. So every strategy in here is research-based, even if it has not yet met the level of what we would call evidence-based, of having a lot of research behind it. It's still research-based, so you can look at that strategy, who's it been used for in the past, and decide, can I just use it as packaged, or do I need to tweak it for my student who might be different from the students that were in these studies?
So it gives you a lot of information to get started. You can take some of the worksheets in there and figure out, all right, how could I adapt this for my student? And as Andy said, everything is research-based. So sometimes when we're thinking about specially designed instruction and I want to make sure it's research-based, how do I find those research-based strategies? Oh, so sorry. No questions now?
Oh, no.
Oh, we
and I
need the
forgot to say
microphone.
that at the beginning. I completely forgot. We do need to use the microphone because we're recorded. There's also little note cards on your table, so if you want to
I
just
forgot.
write
I'm
that.
also talking and I'm not in the box.
Oh, Lisa's not in the box. Get on over here.
It's so hard.
Who's managing the website of Intervention Central?
A lot of that work is done by Jim Wright and his group. He puts a lot of that in there. Can you go to the behavior intervention?
Oh, sure. I was going to try and find the about, but I don't see it. But yes.
there are a lot of strategies for behavior. And there is a little piece that I like that is the behavior report card.
There are a lot of strategies for behavior.
There's a
Is
couple of things
the-
in there.
You know where the report card is?
It was on the bottom, but it looks like they've changed it. But there is it has a behavior tracker, behavior report card where it has a nice template that you can customize, and you can put in which behaviors you want to track, getting their
see it?
materials out. Yes,
Oh,
yes,
there it is.
yes, there
so
it
they moved
is.
it to the top. There we go. Oh, whoops.
So sometimes we struggle with, I need to have some sort of tracking system to monitor students' behavior and help them learn to keep track of their materials, be prepared for class.
And so here's the report card maker.
So it allows you to choose some preset behaviors that you could put in there, or you can just type in your own. And then it allows you to print out, is this something that I want to have the student check, for every period of the day? Is it something that needs to be checked once a day? It allows you to put in frequency. It allows you, do you want to customize it so it's happy faces for maybe a young student, a kindergarten or a first grade? Do you have a happy face or a frowny face? Or you could put in a point system. There are a lot of different ways that you can customize it for the needs of your student.
And again, that's Intervention Central. They also have some videos that I believe are freely available, and then the workshops that you have to pay for if you want to learn more about some of the specific strategies. Now I have to figure out how to get back to my slides. There, oh. Okay. And so we have those tools. And this is just a brief list of types of SDI. It's useful to know that sometimes SDI looks like a package. Like you have a curriculum package like Orton Gillingham. Huh? Oh. Oh, okay. Or the Early Literacy Skills Builder or Early Reading Skills Builder is another program for reading. There's also instructional techniques or strategies. So our learning strategies like forward and backward chaining, using task analyses as an instructional technique.
So most of the strategies that are on that Intervention Central website that we just looked at are going to fit under here, under specially designed instruction in the form of instructional techniques or strategies.
Yeah. And then there's our integrated practices, our pauses for instruction and processing time, our planned practice, our reinforcement. And so it's not just a matter of pulling a curriculum off a shelf and saying that we're doing SDI, because SDI can't be cookie cutter. Even when you pull a curriculum, oftentimes you have to look at what are the needs of the student and how does this curriculum address the needs of the student, and does it? And so these are where we bring in all of our techniques. And so just as a quick clarification of terms, we love differentiation and universal design for learning. And you can do differentiation and universal design for learning at any level of the tier in the MTSS system. So this can be at tier 1, 2, or 3 that you are universally designing your instruction and then differentiating for individual learners. But these are not necessarily alone specially designed instruction. So just because you have universally designed your curriculum, if that curriculum is what every student accesses, and it's great if it addresses the needs of a lot of learners, but it's not specially designed instruction for that individual student who we said is not making progress on the general education curriculum because of their disability identification. And so how does this all fit into co-teaching? Not yet. Or do you want to step in?
No.
We talked about, because we did not plan our co-teaching well right before this lesson, we were like, when are you going to take over? Okay, so special education is not a place. This is something that we come back to, and I'm sure you've probably heard at least once already in the Inclusion Collaborative Conference. But when we think about inclusive service delivery options, it's also not just co-teaching. There's a number of ways that you can provide inclusive education. So there is the consultative services where the special education teacher is consulting with the general education teacher. Oftentimes we see that as we're kind of fading out those services for the student. There's the use of paraprofessionals. So having support in the classroom who receives guidance from the special educator and the general education teacher, I should have put that in there as well, to make sure that the students' needs are being met. There's push-in services where you might go in for a part of the day, and in those services that you might be working on something aligned with what's going on in the classroom, or you might not. Because even when we try, like this is a clear goal that aligns with English language instruction, or I'm sorry, not English language, ELA, English language arts. And so I'm gonna go in during your ELA time, and then you know that the classroom never runs on that schedule. And that's not the general education teacher's fault, it's just that you have to respond to what the students are doing, and sometimes the general education teacher has to modify their instruction and their plan. And then there's co-teaching, and that's when the general education and special education teachers teach the class together. And that involves co-planning, co-teaching, and co-assessing. So the who of SDI and inclusive classrooms is the special education teacher still, determining what SDI is necessary. And the general education teacher then facilitates the administration of SDI in the classroom, providing the time, space, and instruction needed. The when is going to be identified so that way the special education teacher should know when each of the goals is going to be addressed at least once during the week, and can say that we're targeting this goal in this time period. And for those of you who came to Eileen Schwartz's presentation yesterday, so her book is for preschool classrooms, but her goal by activity matrix is really just something that we should do for every student who has IEP goals, I think. So that way we can say, this is when this goal is being addressed. And it's where in the curriculum is at the lesson level that we're providing that instruction. Remembering always that specially designed instruction is the responsibility of the special education teacher. Our general education teachers know the content, and they know the scope and sequence of the curriculum, and they know how to teach well. And they can certainly co-plan that specially designed instruction, but at the end of the day, the special education teacher is the one who has the training on providing systematic and explicit instruction and using those strategies, and therefore needs to be the one making the final decision and monitoring the system so that we can verify that our specially designed instruction is working for the student.
Absolutely. All right, so that brings us to, all right, how are we going to do this in a co-teaching model? So we use co-teaching to support all students, and we're talking about a general education and special education teacher collaboratively instructing a class of students with and without disabilities. I think we can all agree on that. And co-teaching, we want both teachers to be considered as equals, right? They're both have a credential, they're both important people to that instruction. The special educator is not the person that comes in the room just to be the assistant, while the general education teacher is in charge of everything. Right? And so that's a mindset that sometimes we have to make sure our special educators understand. It's something that we work on at the pre-service level before they get out there, trying to inform them and show them how they are going to be the expert in specially designed instruction and how they need to collaborate and work with that general education teacher. But for new special education teachers, and we all know we have a lot of new special education teachers every year, right? We're experiencing some extreme shortages in this area. For new special education teachers, that's often a very difficult thing for them to do, is to take on that role right away of being an equal co-teacher to the general education teacher. Right? But that's what we're working for. Together, they co-plan, co-teach, co-assess. As Andy mentioned earlier, the general education teacher is seen as the content expert. Right? They know the content better than anybody, while the special education teacher is the strategies and intervention expert. They know specially designed instruction. And all students using that model get the help they need while remaining in the general education classroom. I can't emphasize enough the co-plan piece of it. So that has to occur for it to be true co-teaching. If the special educator is coming into the classroom after the general education teacher has done all of the planning and says, okay, I'm here to help, what do you want me to do? That is not co-teaching. That's the education specialist acting as an aid or additional support. Right? So that co-planning has to occur. So for those of you who are administrators in the room, and I know we took a little peek at who signed up for the session, there are some administrators here. That co-planning piece is something that you may really need to support those teachers to do. So it requires that they have time together to do that co-planning. Because if there's no time for them to meet during the school day, sometime during the week, then that co-planning's not going to happen. Right? So really, really important piece there. IEP considerations for co-teaching. We get this question quite a lot. What does that IEP need to look like if I'm going to be delivering specially designed instruction in a co-taught classroom? So we want to make sure that the IEP does match the way that instruction is going to be delivered. So we cannot say on the IEP that the student's going to be pulled out into a separate classroom for 60 minutes a week if the student is receiving specially designed instruction in a co-taught classroom. So don't list it as pull-out service, not 30 minutes of one-on-one instruction. It needs to say that the specially designed instruction will take place in the general education classroom. That also means that the goals have to match what is going on in the general education classroom. So we can't write isolated goals that can only be taught in a special, isolated place, one-on-one, right? That's not what we're looking for. Those are the old days. We're moving away from that because we're recognizing how important it is, how much better off our students are when they're receiving that same general education instruction. So sometimes this means if your school is just gearing up for co-teaching and previously you had done a lot of pull-out, you might have to go back and do some amendments to those IEPs to make sure that the way the SDI is going to be delivered matches what's on that IEP. Right? We see this also when students transition, maybe from an elementary school to middle school or middle school to high school, and they weren't receiving co-teaching previously and they are now. We want to make sure that the IEP lines up with how that SDI is going to be delivered.
Oh, and I'm just going to jump in here. I'm sorry, I'm going to literally jump in the box to say we also need to honor that this decision needs to be made on a student-by-student basis. We're big proponents of inclusive education. We think co-teaching is a great model for providing inclusive education, but We can't say that every student should be in a co-taught classroom or that we only provide co-taught classrooms, because that would be a cookie cutter program, and that goes away from the heart of IDEA, which is that we are designing instruction based on the individual student needs.
Right. And just building off of what Andy just said, IDEA still requires a continuum of services, right? The continuum does not go away.
Was there a question?
Yes, right back here. We, the state of California has, set a goal that 80% of our students with disabilities are going to be in general education 80% of the time, right? That's what we are striving for. Most of our students should be receiving specially designed instruction within that general education classroom. But IDEA has not gone away and has not taken out the continuum of services. Question?
Just a quick clarification. I know that a lot of us are still writing SAI, not SDI. So is there more legal, SAI versus SDI? I don't know if that.
Specialized academic instruction versus
Yes.
specially designed instruction.
Yes.
I don't think the specific wording that you're using there is going to make you out of compliance with the law. And that's going to vary from state to state as long as it's clearly indicated that it is specialized instruction to meet the needs of that student. Some states don't even use IEP team meetings. I know in Texas they call them ARD meetings, annual review and dismissal meetings. So there are some variations in that language from state to state. So wouldn't be, you don't need to obsess over whether it's SAI or SDI, as long as it's very clear that it's specialized instruction to meet the needs of the student with disability. Another question.
Just going back to the co-planning
Yes.
slide that you had, I've kind of informally been talking to different people here who are co-teaching,
Yes.
and everyone has said that they get 2 preps if they're a special ed teacher. So, one for assessment and case managing your IEPs, and then the other one for planning with that gen ed teacher. And I'm just wondering, what's recommended?
What's a recommended amount of prep? So are they saying that 2 preps are not enough? Is that?
No, sorry. They are receiving 2 preps versus just 1 prep.
I think that's awesome. To me, that shows that the district has recognized that they do need that time. I don't think we have anything as far as it needs to strictly be this or that. It needs to be in a manner that those 2 teachers have time to plan together. It is also going to depend on how those students are grouped and how many different classrooms that education specialist is co-teaching in, right? And this is also sometimes another administration decision. Do we want that co-teacher teaching all English language arts or all math, and maybe they are doing 6th grade English and 7th grade English and 8th grade English, and they're having to co-teach with 3 different teachers, but all the same content area? Or are we having that education specialist stick with a specific grade level, maybe 7th grade, and they're co-teaching 7th grade English and 7th grade math and 7th grade science? Okay. If you're doing those 3 different content areas, they may need more prep time, right? Because they are trying to gear up for different content areas versus if they're doing one content area over different grade levels. And there's not necessarily like a right or wrong answer or a prescription that it can only be this or that. It's just that those are considerations that every district and every school needs to take into consideration when they're trying to figure out how much time teachers need together to be able to implement well-designed co-taught lessons. But I am excited to hear that at least some districts back there are giving our ed specialists 2 prep periods, one for their assessment and IEP writing that is ongoing all the time, and another specifically for co-planning with those co-teachers. Right.
Yeah.
But not all districts, based on the information I'm getting from all my interns, not all districts are doing that just yet.
Right, and I've seen a lot of different seminars and things about co-teaching, and there are some standards, and I'm hoping that'll fit its way into a standard like your no more than 1/3 students with IEPs.
Right, we do have
That would be great to see that.
Right, and I'm glad you mentioned, because that was going to be my next piece, is that we do know that it's recommended not more than 1/3 of the classroom is students with disabilities, right? Because otherwise we get an unnatural balance. We want it to be similar to what the general population is, and so we don't want more than 1/3 of students with disabilities in that co-taught classroom. And we're seeing more and more of our districts really striving to meet that, but sometimes, not always, but that's what we're working for. As far as how many preps, I haven't seen anything that says it's a recommended X number of preps for X number of co-taught classes. I think that's gonna vary also by grade continuum. If you're at elementary or high school, that might also be different, whereas the 1/3 students with disabilities in a class is constant across grade levels.
I think the one recommendation that I've seen is to be honest about what you can reasonably co-teach. And I'm thinking at the elementary school level where prep usually occurs before and after the school day. And then we still have our special education teachers who are doing assessment and IEPs. And you can't honestly say that they're going to be co-teaching 5 days a week full-time necessarily. If they need a day to do assessments, IEPs, have meetings, be honest that it's going to be 4 days a week. And that way you're not going out of compliance with your IEP.
So that was actually a question of mine coming from a K-5 lens. We've kind of dibbled and dabbled a little bit with co-teaching. Is it still considered co-teaching if it's occurring 3 to 4 days a week? I mean, if you know what I mean? Because there's no way to run a 5-day model in K-5.
Yeah, you could put that in the IEP by how many minutes in a co-taught each week and how many minutes not. And so I don't think you should feel bad about, well, we're doing co-teaching at 3 days a week right now, because that's what's feasible, and that's the manpower that we have, and we also have to allow the ed specialists to do the other things like assessments and writing IEPs. And along with that being honest piece, it's also, everyone at the school honoring that, and enforcing, maybe it's not the right word, but sort of enforcing that is co-taught time. And so we cannot pull the special education teacher out of that time period because that's the only time so-and-so could come to have the IEP, so we have to have it during that time period. No. We need an emergency sub in so-and-so's room, so let's pull the ed specialist. Or we're having a crisis over here, so let's pull the ed specialist, right? And then that co-taught class, never happens, right? And the general education teacher is oftentimes looking at it like, what's the point of co-teaching? You're never here. You're being pulled out all the time, and then we plan this stuff, and I get stuck doing it all, right? That's no fun.
And I think Going along with that, one of the reasons, there's many reasons that we push to be co-teaching as much of the school day as possible. One of that is to have our students know that you're both teachers and that you're both equally responsible for the class. If you've ever been in a preschool classroom, if you walk into a preschool classroom as an unknown adult, you are a teacher. So the younger the kids are, the less likely they are to question, why are you here and what are you doing? And so if you have that teacher who's there 4 days a week or 3 days a week, who's just also, Miss Andy's here. I never went by my last name. Kids can't pronounce it. So Miss Andy's here. And she's doing her thing that she does when she's here. The kids usually understand that that is a teacher who's equally responsible. But you just want to make sure that it's coming across as clear and that in your planning, you're doing things like, we're going to make sure Miss Andy does introduce the lesson because that signals that she knows what's going on in the lesson and isn't just an aide who's going to come and prod you to say, open your book.
Yes, absolutely. All right, any other questions related to that before we move on, keep going? All right, heading back to where we were again, just to reiterate, the IEP needs to reflect the way instruction, especially design instruction, is actually being implemented. Right? So if you're doing the co-teaching and your IEP does not reflect that in the services, you want to go in and do an amendment for that. Because you are doing a co-taught classroom, it's more important than ever for the general education teacher to be included on what those goals should be for that student. Right? We've always wanted to get the general education teacher input. Now in a co-taught classroom, it's critical that that happens because they're going to know, what's the upcoming content, what does the student need to be successful or be able to do by a year from now. So they need input on that content, and then the ed specialist needs to develop a plan, especially designed instruction, so the student is going to be able to meet that content and acquire that content. Okay, our models of co-teaching, they're kind of all squished together on this picture, but you can see on the upper left, we have the one teach, one drift model. And this is where one person is leading instruction and the other person is rotating around the classroom and assisting students as needed. Many people see that diagram and think, okay, well, the person in the front leading instruction is always the gen ed teacher, and the special ed person is the one that goes around and, as Andy said, pokes people to make sure that they're staying on track, right? But we want to move away from that. The person leading instruction does not always have to be the gen ed teacher. Occasionally, that special ed teacher can be the one that's leading instruction. We want to use that model infrequently. Right? That should not be the type of co-teaching that we are doing the most often, right? Because we're not getting full use of the expertise of the ed specialist. They're just sort of walking around assisting students. And that's okay now and then, but that's not a full co-teaching model, not what we want to be doing all the time. If you look at the middle part, we see that model called team teaching, where both teachers are standing in front of the classroom delivering instruction together. A lot of times when we think about co-teaching, that's the model that sort of pops in our head. Oh, so you mean two teachers standing at the front talking all the time? That's one way to deliver instruction, and sometimes that can be really effective when both teachers are at the front of the room. If there's like role play or scenarios that need to be acted out. I'm thinking like English language arts, social studies, guided notes, modeling something on the board. That can be a great way to do it. But again, the team teaching model of co-teaching is not the one we want to rely on all of the time. We should also be using that one infrequently, right? Because again, you're not getting very much bang for your buck when you have both teachers standing in front of the room. Right? A huge benefit of co-teaching is that we're going to reduce the ratio of students to teachers, right? And be able to work in smaller groups. So team teaching, while is effective and we can use it, we don't want to rely on that all the time. The last model on the top right is called parallel teaching. And you can see there are two teachers here, and they have split the class in half. So they're each working with half of the class. In parallel teaching, they're teaching the same content, just to a smaller group of students. So you actually would have them both in the same classroom, kind of pushed off one side to the other side. When you move to a model where both of the teachers are teaching a smaller subset of the class, then you are getting more opportunity for students to receive more personalized instruction, right? You have a smaller group. You can more closely monitor who's doing what, who needs a little bit more help. It's also an opportunity for students to be able to ask questions more often, get more individualized feedback. Some students don't feel comfortable raising their hand in front of the whole class, and so if you're working in a smaller group, they may be able to participate more and feel more comfortable asking questions. I want to, so kind of going around clockwise, underneath the parallel teaching, we have station teaching. Again, both teachers are working with a group of students, a smaller group. So we'll have the ed specialist at a station, we'll have the general education teacher at a station, and in most models, we'll have one independent station. You can do it with 4 stations and have 2 independent stations. In this model, the education specialist and the general education teacher are teaching different things at their station. But the students rotate through all of the stations. Okay. This is where we want to spend the bulk of our time in co-taught classrooms. This is where we're getting small group instruction, and we're getting the expertise of both teachers. And we're going to show you, we have a video of the station teaching we'll show in just a second. The one teach, one observe, moving to the middle, is much like the one teach, one drift that we started with, but the observe, the person doing the observing is observing for very specific information and is recording some sort of data. So it might be data on students, right? How many students are participating, or maybe you're looking at a particular target student and you want to know how many times they're asking questions, or how many times they're out of their seat, that sort of thing. The observation could also be on the adult, the person doing the instruction. So sometimes it's helpful for the person doing the observing to just watch the other teacher and write down, how many times did you use specific praise statements? How many times did you do XYZ, just to provide that feedback to each other on our own instruction, right? We can all benefit from having someone watch us for brief periods of time and give us some feedback on that. The one teach, one observe, again, doesn't always have to be the gen ed teacher teaching and the special ed teacher observing. It could be either person in either role. And then that last model is alternative teaching, where the bulk of the students are doing the work of the day, the teacher's instructing that, and then the second co-teacher has a small group of students pulled out to the side of the room, and they're doing some sort of alternative instruction. Sometimes we need to do this for brief periods of time with our students with disabilities. They may need some specialized instruction pulled out or off to the side. It doesn't have to just be students with disabilities, though. It could be anybody that needs help, right? So you may have a small group of students who have no identified disability, students who are English learners, and students with disabilities, and maybe a group of 5 that just need a little extra support on this one aspect of instruction, or they need some pre-teaching of vocabulary. So you do that, for a short amount of time, and then get them back into what's going on in the rest of the class. It can also be used for students who need extension, right? Sometimes we have students who are ready to move forward and do something a little bit more. You could do alternative teaching for that. Okay. Any questions about any of those models? Yes?
I just was going to say that a hybrid of these, I've been a part of too, where it might start out in sort of a team teaching mini lesson, everyone's getting content, and then break out into the station teaching. So I don't think you need to think about these models as one, just doing one of them. You can hybrid them, and it can be really powerful too.
Absolutely. I'm really glad you mentioned that. And in our sample lesson plan, we'll talk about that in a second. But you're absolutely right. I think when we are first being introduced to the idea of co-teaching, we sort of wrap our head around, okay, there's this one model, and I'm going to use that one model for the whole 45-minute period. But the reality of it is, no, it doesn't have to be one model. You might start out doing some team teaching, and then go into station teaching, and then go back to team teaching again. All right, so within a given time period, you may be using 2 or 3 or more of those co-teaching models, right? What we don't want to see is this alternative teaching going on all the time. So we don't want the general education teacher doing the instruction of the whole class, and the special ed teacher have a small group out, pulled to the back, always doing something different. Right? That's not a co-teaching model. That's basically a pull-out model. All right. So think of it as a model that we're going to use sometimes, but we're going to use it infrequently. All right, so let's take a look at the station teaching model.
In this strategy, station teaching, the co-teachers In this strategy, station teaching, the co-teachers divide their class into small groups to provide instruction at separate stations.
Station teaching is a chance for 2 teachers to work together and provide some individualized attention to smaller groups of students while covering several different pieces of the curriculum.
Sharon and Jan have divided their class into 4 small groups, and those groups rotate between specific stations, each station presenting different but often related content. Jan will teach Station 1, and Sharon will teach Station 3. At Stations 2 and 4, students will work independently, with both teachers monitoring their progress.
When you can get them in these groups, you can employ a lot of different strategies. For one thing, it's more sort of 1-on-7, which makes it more manageable. But the other thing is we can strategize who we put in the groups.
We can also group by ability. So I can take some extra time with a group who maybe has fewer skills, and I can let the more independent learners work on their own. So it allows us to split our groups up into a variety of different configurations.
After a designated amount of time at each station, the groups will rotate.
And the nice thing about working with stations is we can really modify the curriculum to match what our students need, because it's much smaller pieces. It's not an hour of one topic, it's several small topics in shorter amounts of time.
Station teaching reduces the student-teacher ratio, increasing student participation and effective monitoring of the students.
I think you can also identify and feed into the curiosity of students better when you're in exploration stations, because you can actually see right in front of you somebody kind of, oh, this is grabbing my interest, and you can kind of run with that and make an educational moment out of it, and also a memorable moment and an engagement moment.
Since this is a highly engaging instructional format, teachers may need to manage the noise level in the classroom. To be effectively implemented, the activities at each station should function independently of each other and should require roughly the same amount of time to be completed. It is recommended that this strategy be used frequently to enhance learning outcomes.
Something that's really important to me as a teacher, I feel like the kids are being heard in the small groups a little bit more, because everybody gets a chance to speak.
There's a lot of different models we can follow, but it's always together and it's always with each other in mind and our students first.
All right. Let's see if we can get this back. All right, so that's an excellent video of station teaching. There are a couple of important points that they mentioned in there, that when you're doing station teaching, the activities need to be independent of each other. You can't have an activity where you have to do in a certain order, right? Because not everybody can start at station 1. Some people have to start at station 2 and 3 and 4. So if the activities have to go in a certain order, then that's not going to work out for station teaching. And so they did mention that make sure that they can function independently of each other, and that the activities take about the same amount of time. All right, you can't have an activity that's going to take 25 or 30 minutes and at station 1, and at station 2 something that the students are done with in 5 minutes, right? That never works out well. So making sure that it's equal time and they can function independently. But you can see in that model with the general education teacher and the special education teacher each taking a different station, you're really able to do some individualized instruction and put in those specific supports for the students who need it. All right. Can we move it forward? Oh. Is that the last thing?
Is there any questions about, I'm going to get in the box. Are there any questions about station teaching? We could talk, I know there's a lot of questions about how to make it run smoothly. We could talk about that for hours. But are there any kind of general questions or comments about using something like station teaching?
I'm curious about all the resources you're using, and are we going to have access, like a video like that is so powerful for maybe a group of principals to see or something?
Yeah, you know, I'm trying to remember if I put the slides on Sketch. Not this, I did. Not the slides. Okay. Oh, because it was a Google slide, and I wasn't sure how to do that.
So we can just work with the
Yeah, we'll work with
excellent
England.
inclusion collaborative people here. We have, that was just one. There are videos for all 6 of those models, and we're using them at the university with many of our pre-service candidates. So we'd be happy to share those. We don't own the rights to them, and they're readily
They're on
available.
YouTube.
Yeah. So,
Yeah.
and it's really hard to find good teaching videos. I mean, we struggle with that every day. So we're super excited when we find some.
And so we started off with co-teaching for equity. We talked about issues in special education and issues in the concept of inclusion, especially in California. I mean, really across the country, but really especially in California, especially in our melting pot of the Bay Area. Other issues come up in our instruction beyond ability status. And so something that we've been working on at in our departments and across our departments is how can this co-teaching model be used to address issues of equity? This framework for characteristics of inclusive teachers, I think, is really helpful when we're thinking about what are the characteristics that we're looking for in our teachers, we're preparing our teachers for. And if you are in a school program, who might you look to be someone who might be one of your early adopters of this model? This model actually came from, it used to be the characteristics of culturally responsive teachers. And then the authors said, you know, actually, with just a small tweak, we can make this, it's fully inclusive. And so our inclusive teachers do bring in a sociocultural consciousness and understanding of the ways our students' lives impact their learning in the classroom. A commitment to acting as a change agent, especially if you're going to be an early adopter in a school, that you're going to need to persist through some challenges. As the presentation from Prospect High said, you need to give this at least a year just to get started. Knowing about students' lives and using the insights into students' lives to build bridges to their learning. Understanding how learners construct knowledge, and having affirming views about diversity and students from diverse backgrounds in your classroom. We're not doing them a favor by having them in the classroom. They're an important member of our classroom. So we are all familiar with Universal Design for Learning. It's a wonderful framework that has organized a lot of research-based practices into a comprehensible framework for teachers when they're thinking about how to design the general curriculum, and then also how to design our education opportunities across the different tiers of support that we provide. And I'm not going to go into too much in depth, but to note that we have the multiple means of engagement, representation, and action and expression, and thinking about how do we provide those multiple means in our classrooms. Now, when we teach about Universal Design for Learning, if you go to a presentation about Universal Design for Learning, often it's said that this isn't just for students with disabilities. These strategies benefit all students. It's just like having the curb cut in the sidewalk, that now if you have the, stroller, what'd you say? Oh, yeah. Then across the hall from us, across the building, one of our colleagues worked on the ELISA project, the English Language and Literacy Integration in Subject Areas project. They worked really hard to get an acronym for that. And so they were teaching this in their course on how to work with English learners. So there's 4, don't read, you don't have to read it. But the 4 general areas are: 1, promoting academic discourse, having the opportunity to use the language; supporting literacy development; scaffolding language and content; and contextualizing learning. And so they developed this model, or this framework. They started, creating videos of teachers using these different strategies. And then my colleague David White came to me and said, oh, he went to a training on Universal Design for Learning, and then he came to us and said, so do you guys know about Universal Design for Learning? And we said, yes, we do. He says, I think there's a lot of overlap. We're like, oh, yes, there is. But it's not perfect overlap. And one of the things that we found students were doing is that they were saying, if I'm thinking about having students with disabilities in my class, I should use Universal Design for Learning. But if I'm thinking about having English language learners in my class, I should use the ELISA framework. And so as a general education teacher, you're thinking, I now have the general education curriculum, UDL, and ELISA, when that's not at all what any of these frameworks are supposed to be. They're supposed to be integrated fully. And so we developed, So these are some commonalities. I'll just put them all up here. So when you look across them, there's some commonalities across them. So one is like the use of visuals or realia. That supports emergent multilinguals. It also supports kids with autism spectrum disorders and a variety of different learning needs. Graphic organizers, pre-teaching vocabulary, highlighting key information, reducing cognitive load, and the scaffolding, gradual release of control and fading of prompts. So these are all strategies that were both on ELISA and on UDL, and that we know are good teaching. And so we wanted our students to understand this as one thing. And so we developed the Tier 1 Strategies framework. And in here, the idea is that we're gonna focus on that bottom tier. What is good instruction in that bottom tier? That supports all students in the general education classroom, aligns with the UDL practices, integrates language and literacy development across all content lessons, and I'm gonna skip those bullet points, asks teachers to consider how they engage in dynamic instruction and stimulate student learning, and can be used to encourage conversations between general education teachers, special educators, and bilingual resource teachers. And so we ended up with 5 domains: contextualization, growth mindset, scaffolding, discourse, and literacy. And I know these are on Sketch. So I'm gonna just pull up this is the overall framework. And within each one, you can see these are kind of more teacher actions, and these are things that you should be looking to see if students are doing. So a teacher the first thing that we want teachers to think about is the contextualization. It's the same reason that CAST put engagement as their first guideline now, that we want to be connecting with students' learning, prior learning, and with their home lives. And so what can a teacher do? And then what are we seeing students doing in their learning? You'll see that some of these are clearly aligned with a UDL checkpoint. And because those UDL checkpoints have a lot of resources available online, we wanted people to be able to go back and look at them. And so they're there if they are fully aligned. The one area so scaffolding, UDL is like kind of all over the scaffolding piece. The one piece that UDL didn't quite capture a lot of was this issue of promoting academic discourse, that we know our emergent bilinguals students need to have that time to practice, but also how many of our students who have identified needs, special education needs, also need time to practice their academic language, right? And so we have some strategies for modeling the discourse patterns, revoicing or restating student contributions, providing students with feedback, and then getting kids to talk. So you should be able to see that kids are talking in your class, and that they're talking using academic language. And so this is one tool that we hope is useful. I believe, we have made a variety of different observation tools. Like if you wanted to use this, you could go into the classroom and take a narrative, like I see the teacher doing what and I see the students doing what. Other people, because our supervisors are now starting to use this, have come up with different rubrics. Oh wait, that's our lesson plan. The rubric is over here. Rubrics just to score on a 0, 1, 2, 3, did I see you do that a lot or not very much? And so this is just an additional strategy building off of and extending that UDL framework. And again, because we see sometimes teachers, again, trying to break that student apart. I'm gonna give this to you for your language learning needs. I'm gonna give this to you for your learning disability. And really it should all be integrated together because that student is bringing all of that into their learning. Then in our conversations, we had this really, radical idea. As we have been working with our colleagues across the building, because we're still a little siloized in our departments, we've been really problem solving, what would this look like? How would we recommend that schools and teachers use the resources in a way that gets the most bang for the buck? And we proposed this idea of a triad approach. Not that you would necessarily have 3 teachers in a classroom. If you have the funding to put 3 teachers in a classroom, like, can I come work for you? Maybe certain parts of the day. But thinking about,
Love that positive attitude.
Yeah.
Yes.
So thinking about having the general education teacher, special education, and bilingual resource teacher coming together around instruction, having conversations. Even if the special education teacher isn't going to be there in that lesson, what can they tell you about the accommodations and specially designed instruction that might be useful in that time for that student or for those students? And what can the bilingual resource teacher tell us? Sometimes in special education, we really overlook what we can do to use L1 in supporting learning English. And so bringing them together so that the GE teacher does design lessons using UDL principles. The SPED teachers support the GE teachers to implement UDL, and as special educators, we often know a lot more about accommodations than our gen ed teachers have been trained on. SPED teachers designing and delivering SDI, the SPED teacher and bilingual resource teacher helping the GE teacher monitor instruction. So we're all going together and thinking about how those different roles might work together. And so that's our somewhat radical approach. And now we're going to talk about how might we plan for doing that.
Rush there.
Rush. Well, I see we have like 15 minutes now.
Yes.
And now you're going to want to spend some time on this. You want to start with the plan?
Yes. Okay, so Andy just went through really quickly this idea that we're working as a team in the co-teaching world, and so we can meet the needs of our students with identified disabilities as well as working on our students who are English learners, right? Because as we started this conversation talking about intersectionality, we have a lot of students who fall into both categories. And years ago, we sort of adopted this mindset. You were either a student with a disability or you were a student who was an English learner. And if once you became a student with an identified disability, you no longer really had access to those services for students who were English learners because that was all separate. But now we have come to see the light that actually there is an intersectionality between all of this, and students aren't one or the other. Many of our students are both, and so they need support in both areas. And actually the state has given us very specific targets on how our students with disabilities and who are also English learners need to be doing and the progress that they need to be making. And across the state, we're all trying to improve our instruction that way. So I wanted to kind of give you an example of how this might play out in a lesson plan. So I believe we put these resources in the resource folder. Yes. So starting with just a plain lesson plan that was developed. This is in language arts lesson on what is a topic sentence. You can see that the GE teacher and the SE teacher start out doing some team teaching at the beginning of the lesson, just like our example from earlier. And then they move into some station teaching where they're each doing a different station. And this one is 3 stations, so there's 1 independent station. And then they wrap up with some assessment where they're again doing that team teaching approach. So this is a nice lesson plan, but it doesn't, is this the one? Go back. It doesn't really, we have 2 different ones here. Make sure we get the right one. Yes, okay. but it doesn't specifically call out how specially designed instruction is actually going to happen in that co-taught lesson, right? And this is often the piece that is missing. I know with our pre-service teachers, I coordinate the intern program, and when I'm talking with our interns, I actually had one tell me just last week, oh, I like doing the co-teaching because the gen ed teacher just plans and then I just go in and help. And I'm like, no, we have a problem there. So we're really trying to work with our candidates, know that SDI needs to actually be written into the lesson plan. So we've provided an example for you here. And one of the things that we would really encourage people to do who are in those co-teaching relationships or settings, our ed specialists, is to actually track how that SDI is implemented, right? So a spreadsheet is quite useful. And if you are putting it right into the lesson plan, that can actually be documentation for you. So if someone comes back later and says, well, how did you implement SDI in this lesson or that lesson? You have the lesson plan and it's right there. So taking the beginning of the lesson where they're just, introducing the topic of a topic sentence, they have a little bell ringer that they're doing at the beginning. The general ed teacher, starts the lesson, make sure that everyone has the material, and then they're kind of both going over, what is a topic sentence and making sure students get that down into their little journal that they start the lesson with. So if we're thinking about supports for students who are English learners, we can make sure at this time of the lesson that we're building background by reviewing yesterday's lesson and the previously taught content. And when they are doing their main idea worksheet, filling in the page, we can build in some time for students to actually do some partner talk, to build in that discourse piece that Andy was talking about. And maybe even provide a sentence frame for them to structure that conversation. A topic sentence is, and let them fill in the blank. Okay. And if we're thinking about, all right, so what is that specially designed instruction that we need for our students with disabilities? So SDI is going to, be specific to the needs of your students, but hypothetically, if we had students with learning disabilities or high functioning autism or other health impairments such as ADHD, these are some of the general strategies that might be appropriate for that. So the bell ringer is something that the teacher had on the board and the students had to copy down. Our student with a disability might need a pre-printed version of that with key information highlighted, right? They also might need that sentence frame, a topic sentence is, to help them get started on what to write down. We can pair that student with a disability with a knowledgeable peer when we're talking about that discourse piece, making sure that they are doing that conversation with a typical peer that doesn't have a language or learning issue. And then we can also provide a model for them. Sometimes they might need an example of the worksheet. Right? So different types of SDI in that beginning part of the lesson. So we talked about documenting SDI on a spreadsheet. Well, right there in the beginning, I know that I used highlighting of critical information, key terms, provided a sentence frame to support that interaction and to begin writing, increase the opportunity to respond, and provided students with an example worksheet. Then moving down to the middle part of the lesson, the main body, where they're broken into different groups. One group is at the GE teacher station, is picking out 3 topic sentences from 3 paragraphs. And in the special education teacher station, they're picking out keywords from a reading that help identify the main idea. So some of the strategies for our English learners in that middle part, again, ensuring that our English learner is in a group with an English only or a native English speaker to ensure they have the opportunity to hear English. Again, provide more opportunity for student discourse, partner talk, again, sentence frames. Looking over at that last column, well, what about the SDI? What is specially designed instruction? So ensuring that our student with a disability is in a group with a knowledgeable peer. We can pre-teach with that peer how to support the student with disability. So making use as peer-mediated types of intervention. And then we can also teach the student with disability to monitor their own behavior in group activities using a reinforcement system. So early on in our discussion, we talked about if a student just needs accommodations, they shouldn't need to be on an individualized education plan. SDI is where we are teaching students to do something, not just giving them things. So here we might need to, again, teach a peer how to interact. We might need to teach the student with disability how to monitor their behavior in the group activity before they get started, or reinforce it if we've already taught them how to do that. Student with disability might need to have the teacher or a peer read the paragraph aloud to them. Right? You could also use a screen reader if one's available, and that's appropriate for the setting. Again, provide a sentence frame. I think blank is the topic sentence because making sure our student with disability is actually getting some very goal-specific feedback related to how they're doing in that lesson. And then also another element of SDI might be that during that transition, we teach or reteach the student to use self-monitoring to transition between activities and making sure that they have their materials, providing, again, more sentence frames for them to talk with their peers. So just taking those elements that we had put in the lesson plan and documenting them, how we use SDI in that portion of the lesson. We paired them with a knowledgeable peer, we did some pre-teaching, we monitored their behavior, we taught them to monitor their own behavior, we highlighted critical information, and we helped them to self-monitor or taught them to self-monitor during the transition. All right.
Hi,
Yes,
so I have
we need the 5 minute, 1 minute, 0 minute warning.
almost, yes. But I have a question, and then about students who have 504s who aren't on the aren't being serviced by the special education teacher, but they're not in there and may need to be in there because they may need some of the supports, like an example.
Right, right. So you could put that in there as well. The interesting thing about the 504 plan, the law doesn't really require us to monitor that at all, right? We develop it, but it doesn't say it has to be monitored or they have to make progress. We don't necessarily develop a goal for them. We just say these things are going to be available. But of course, if you are documenting all of that in your lesson plan, it would also be a great place to document that the student who was on the 504 plan got such and such, such and such. Okay. All right, so we are definitely at the end of our time here. We did put both of these resources in the resource folder for you. So if you want to take a little more in-depth look at how SDI is incorporated in that co-taught lesson, you can look at it there in the resource folder. Okay.
Thank you, everyone.
All right, thank you.